Hello, I'm Dr. Geri Puleo, the President and CEO of Change Management Solutions, and I'd like to welcome you to Stressors Are Neutral, but Stress is Personal. In this video, you'll learn the crucial differences between a stressor and the feelings of stress so that you can avoid a potential burnout. So the first thing that we need to talk about is what specifically is a stressor? Well, the first thing is that a stressor is something that is external. It's an external demand that is being placed upon you. A stressor is not, however, the internal emotional response that you have to that demand. So, for example, an external stressor could be a looming deadline, or it could be a manager who is a micromanager and is constantly breathing down your neck to get that work done so that you can meet the deadline. But the feelings that you have about these demands are not stressors. That's something very different. And the important thing to remember here is that the exact same stressor will affect different people in different ways. So if it's the same micromanaging leader who is demanding that you meet a looming and what you may view as an impossible deadline, will determine whether or not you respond to a stressor with some type of a stressful reaction. Now that we know what a stressor is, it's the stress that is normally what causes people the most problems. Stress is an internal body state. In other words, stress is what you are feeling in response to that stressor. Now, remember I said that the same stressor can be responded to by two different people in two different ways. And that is based upon, here's the key, your perception of that stressor. So in other words, the stressors aren't stressful. It's the feelings of stress that represent your perception of that particular stressor. So stress is not an external situation. Now, in our modern workplace, we often say, oh, it's a high stress environment. But that is just reflecting an employee's perception of the external demands or stressors that are being placed upon them. In other words, stress is an emotional response, and depending on your perception of that stressor, the feeling of stress may be positive or negative. Now think about that for a minute. Many people think that all stress is negative, but some types of stress can actually be positive. And since there are different types of stress, let's go into them in more detail. First is eustress, and then there's distress, and then of course there's burnout. Well, eustress is the happy dance. Eustress is positive stress. Now, some of you might be saying, oh, come on, all stress is negative. I feel terrible when I'm stressed out. But think about this. Think if you're going on a vacation that you've been planning for a very, very long time and you're finally going to get to go away. Now, obviously, there are demands being placed upon you. You have to make your travel and lodging accommodations. You have to pack. You may have to find a place for your pets to stay while you're on vacation. There's all kinds of different demands that are being placed upon you, but you're excited about those demands and not anxious. In other words, you're actually looking forward to the stressor occurring, which in this case would be the vacation, instead of recoiling from it. Now, that's very different than distress. Distress is where you perceive the stressor as something that is fearful to you, that causes anxiety, that you're apprehensive about meeting, and you're basically very, very worried about this potential stressor. Now, These are just different perceptions, but perception is your reality. So, what types of perceptions usually lead to distress rather than feelings of eustress for the same situation? Well, let's talk a little bit more about distress. When it comes to distress, the stressor, or again, that external demand that is being placed upon you, is often characterized by one of or more of these five situations. First, the stressor might not really be easily identifiable. It's the type of stress that occurs when you know that something is wrong, but you just don't know what it is. You can't identify it. Or stressors that often lead to feelings of distress occur because they are excessive demands. For example, work overload. Suddenly your boss is telling you, forget the 40-hour work week. We have a big deadline. You're going to have to be working 60 to 70 hours per week. And just for the record, if you work on average 60 hours per week, you're at a much higher probability of burning out. And what about if the stressor is repeated? It's where people say it's the same old. Nothing is ever going to change. They always put these demands on us, and there's nothing that's going to change with it. Or the stress is prolonged. Excuse me, the stressor is prolonged. This is when you feel that there's absolutely no end in sight. And if you're really stressed out, that light at the end of the tunnel, you might be afraid that that's a train coming your way. And then finally, a stressor that can lead to feelings of distress are often continuous. There's no break from the repeated demands that are being placed upon you. And what this manifests in are often negative physical problems, disease, or let's break that down, dis-ease. In other words, you aren't in a state of ease or relaxation, but you're feeling off. You're feeling that something is wrong. This is where you get a lot of the chronic situations and physical ailments that lead to about 90% of visits to primary care physicians. It's that cold that you can't seem to shake. It's chronic upset stomach. It can be skin infections. All of these things can be related to high feelings of distress. And as we also know, distress is manifested in negative psychological disorders. These can range from feelings of anxiety to being escalated to a full-blown depression and to feelings of even paranoia. But as bad as distress is, there still exists a state of stress that is beyond distress. And the state beyond distress is burnout. Now, burnout early signs are usually ignored by most people. Distress isn't a full-blown burnout. Burnout is a much more intensive feeling of being frustrated, angry, apathetic, and paranoid and worried. Burnout is oftentimes responded to by continuing to do the same actions or activities or behaviors, even though you can tell that they aren't working. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, if you're distressed, obviously you're anxious. If you're in eustress, you're really happy. But when you're burned out, there's something else going on. You seem to be stuck. So let's dive into this situation of burnout, which I call the uber stress or the extreme stress. There are several feelings that are associated with being in a full-blown burnout, and you can kind of equate them to feelings of, well, drowning. It often starts in burnout with feelings of helplessness, that you're just not sure what to do, you're not sure where to go. If you don't take action to remediate these feelings, that's going to quickly descend into a feeling of losing control. When you feel that you've lost control, that will create intense feelings of anxiety and panic and even disorientation. And then there's some other things that you need to understand about burnout, particularly within the workplace. Many of the participants in my research on burnout during organizational change, which culminated in the BDOC or burnout during organizational change model, found that when they originally um, responded to the external stressor, they were generally hopeful. But because these stressors had the characteristics of being unidentifiable or excessive, repeated, prolonged, continuous, etc., they started going into this downward spiral into a full-blown burnout. And that led to feelings of intense frustration that something's wrong, but I just can't seem to do anything about it. And then when you lose the control, the feelings became, well, rage. When people are angry during burnout, it's usually because they feel very thwarted in their attempts to try to relieve the feelings of stress that are associated with that stressor. Now, again, just kind of like a drowning person, you sometimes get this feeling of I just have to let go. And that's where the apathy comes in. The only way to save yourself and not succumb is to separate and to no longer care. And for many people who burn out, when they see stressors around them in the workplace that they just can't seem to control and which they may believe are unfair or even unethical, but they still need the job, they will become very apathetic. And as they become apathetic, they don't care anymore. There's no engagement, there's no commitment, and they just don't feel right in their skin. Now, all of these types of psychological and emotional responses will eventually lead into physical malaise. And this is when you get extreme versions of health problems. It can be headaches, migraines, gastrointestinal problems, cancer, cardiovascular events. Burnout is the uber stress. It is a state beyond feelings of just distress. So it's important that we recognize the key differences between the three types of stress. Eustress, distress, and burnout are all stress reactions based on perceptions of an external stressor. So eustress is the good stress. We want to feel happy. We want to feel excited. We're human beings and we want to have something new. We want to have something to look forward to and to be hopeful about. And any fears that you may have when you're in a state of eustress are usually limited because eustress will cause some adrenaline surges. So you're going to power through it. Uh, in my own situation, when I was doing my dissertation for my PhD, it was scary, but it was something that I was looking forward to, and I believed that I was capable of completing the dissertation and doing a good job. So even though it was stressful, my feeling was more of eustress because it's something that I really wanted to do. Now, eustress, unfortunately, tends to be of a somewhat shorter duration than feelings of distress and burnout, which tend to be a little bit more prolonged. The key thing with eustress as a response to an external stressor is that you want to respond to that external stressor. There were many demands when I was doing my dissertation, but I wanted to do them. Had I not wanted to do them, then instead of being elated with eustress, I would have fallen down into distress, which is the bad stress. Now, I mentioned before that eustress is relatively short-lived in comparison to the other more negative types of stress. And one of the reasons for that is during distress, it can be exacerbated by repetitive negative self-talk. These are things like, I don't want to do this, I can't do this, I won't do this, but I must do this. And this is what causes the feelings of negative stress or distress within the body. And as I mentioned, distress tends to last longer than feelings of eustress. And that's because you feel that you have to respond to the external stressor. Now, I mentioned the dissertation when it came to eustress, but think of something else. Think if you were working for an employer, you were very happy in your job, and then the company got bought out by another company. And you found out that the job that you've loved and that you've done for so long and you've done so well was being eliminated. So you have to go into a job search. And you don't want to. Your perception of this external stressor, which is your job is being eliminated, so therefore, if you want to have any income, you have to find another job. Your perception of that is very negative. And because the perception of that situation is negative, you're going to fall into distress. Now, if you weren't as happy with that job, or if you had a good network and you had other opportunities, when the company was acquired and your job was eliminated, instead of responding to the external demand of finding a new job with anxiety, you may have been elated and you may have been enthusiastic because it was going to give you a chance to try something new. But as I mentioned, burnout is the uber stress, and that is distress in the extreme. And burnout, even more than distress, negatively impacts you emotionally, psychologically, and physically. And it takes a lot longer. It tends to take approximately 2 years after you remove yourself from the burnout producing external stressor or situation. It takes 2 years for you to really kind of get back to where you were before that burnout. And what you have to worry about is that during that 2 year recovery period, you can boomerang via something that I discovered, which I call residual burnout. This is where you go from recovery to some type of an external stressor, triggers something in you, and you revert back to the negative feelings of distress and burnout that you had before. And when it comes to responding to the situation, what makes it so difficult with burnout and what kind of sabotages recovery in many situations is that there are such intense feelings of hopelessness that it limits your response to those external stressors. In other words, you feel that you absolutely cannot respond. Your negative self talk has gone even more negative, and you believe that you really have no hope and you're not going to be able to survive it. As I said, burnout is the uber stress. If distress is bad, then burnout is very, very bad. But after all that negativity, I do have to tell you that there is some good news. Remember how I said that your perception is your reality? If you change your perception of the stressor, then you can change your experience of stress associated with it. So if perception is reality, let's take a look at this sequence. A stressor happens in your life, and you will obviously perceive that stressor, make a judgment of that stressor, and based on that judgment, that will lead to your emotional responses to it. If you perceive the stressor as an opportunity, something that is desirable, and you have a belief in your own ability to respond effectively to that stressor, then you'll probably have feelings of excitement and eustress, which is the positive stress. In sharp contrast, If you perceive the stressor as something that is to be feared, something that you want, and that you doubt your own ability to respond to it, then that will lead to feelings of distress. And if these feelings through your self-talk are prolonged, that distress will revert into burnout. So that's the good news, really. Perception is reality. A stressor, or what's going on outside of you and making demands on you, is inherently neutral. You have the power to choose the type of stress response that you will have to that stressor. Good luck.